Hey y'all, this is the second round of video notes you guys are going to take on psychoactive drugs. You've already started learning about the general principles and properties behind any kind of drug, no matter what it does to you physically or mentally. So now what you guys are going to start to tackle is the different types and subsets. A lot of this stuff is going to seem pretty familiar to you for the most part because most of you guys are fairly familiar with these drugs, not necessarily because you have personal experience with them, but more, more so just because people know about them from TV shows and um, things along those lines. So let's get into the first round of this content. There are essentially three categories that you're going to need to know about when it comes to the different types of drugs. There's depressants, there's stimulants, and then there's hallucinogens. So we're going to tackle the depressants first. Okay. The two greatest that we're going to discuss that suppress or inhibit brain activity, so they slow it down, hence why it's called a depressant, is going to be alcohol and narcotics. Some people do categorize narcotics in a different sense outside of a depressant. They give them their own category. But traditionally, since what narcotics do is to slow down or inhibit brain activity, we do, in this class at least, combine them in the depressant category with alcohol. So alcohol is going to be the first one that we take a look at individually. Okay, so when it comes to how it works, what alcohol does is it goes after certain neurotransmitters in your brain. These were things that we learned about back in Unit 3 to slow them down. And so essentially what happens is the neurons don't fire as quickly as they would normally. And so you get highly impaired cognitive functioning. Much of this you guys are aware of. You get a loss of concentration, memory, lots of blackouts occur when someone has drank too much. Slurred speech, they can't put the words together right, or they can't formulate the words well, and physical abilities like muscle coordination and balance. When we were learning about neurotransmitters, I told you, and brain structures in general, I told you that one of the biggest brain structures that's impacted by alcohol is the cerebellum. And that's why when they do field sobriety tests, if they suspect somebody of having a DUI, they're going to do something that requires the person to show that their muscular coordination and balance is on point. So they've got to take their fingers and tip them to the touch of their nose. Um, they've got to walk a straight line. And many of you guys are aware that the more and more alcohol that a person ingests, the more these pieces become highly noticeable. Okay, so you are more than welcome to go to any of these facts here. I'll point out this one that I think is probably the most startling to most kids. Please apologize, or I apologize. Ignore the some, many thousands of tabs that I have open here. Um, but I think the one that stands out the most to me is this guy right here, that the average first attempt at trying alcohol is 11 years old for boys and 13 for girls. And in the vast majority of circumstances, those are binge drinking experiences. It's not simply just having a taste, it's attempting to ingest a large quantity of alcohol for the desired purpose of getting drunk. Okay, so you're welcome to take a look at these facts. They're linked in the in Google Classroom that goes along with this set of notes. But I'm also going to point you to this scan of a woman with alcoholism. So this is an MRI of this woman's brain tissue. And you can see that this is a regular functioning woman, so somebody who does not have alcoholism. And then you can see the scan of somebody who does. Guys, I cannot stress this enough. And I know I've been open with you guys about the circumstances within my family where I've witnessed people with alcoholism struggle and ultimately die because of that addiction that they had. Um, Look at how dark this MRI is. All of that blackness is lost brain matter. It's gone. It's no longer present in the person. So imagine how deteriorated their cognitive functionality is, the more and more and more and more and more they expose themselves to this particular drug. Okay? In terms of how it affects the body, as blood alcohol levels rise, you know this, the more impaired somebody is going to become to a point where they can lose consciousness. And if it goes even further beyond that, a person can literally die because of blood alcohol poisoning. There have been several circumstances that have happened in the news very recently over the last couple of years of pledges in fraternities who died because of hazing rituals where they were forced to consume just insane quantities of alcohol, and their bodies could not handle it, and so they ended up dying as a result of it. Typically, a body can metabolize out one alcoholic drink. So that equates to 1 ounce of 80 proof liquor. So what you're essentially looking at is a shot, 4 ounces of wine, or 12 ounces of beer. Those would be the parameters for differentiation on that. Okay. You heard me share this with you guys in the earlier lesson on general properties of alcohol, but women, they cannot handle going toe to toe with a gentleman when it comes to their tolerance. Because men have more muscle mass, their bodies are more capable of metabolizing out the alcohol faster than a woman. So a woman will become more intoxicated. They'll get drunk more easily than a guy can because women don't have the muscle mass that men do as a result. Alcohol is considered to be physically and psychologically addictive, which is an important note. Um, it's not just your body going through a hangover, for example, the next day, trying to tell you, I got so used to having that in my system and I desperately need it again, or you're going to feel awful for a while. It's also a psychologically addictive thing. Anytime that there is a teenager or a college student out there who's saying to themselves, I need alcohol to make myself feel comfortable at a party, or to be able to talk to other people, or I can't enjoy myself if I don't go to a party and drink a lot, that's a psychologically addictive property. Okay, the person is telling themselves that it's necessary at a mental level, not just a physical level. When a person becomes addicted to alcohol and they go without it, withdrawal symptoms can become, depending on the amount of tolerance that the person's built for it, they can range anywhere from anxiety and mild tremors. So the person gets the shakes really bad. It's very common for you to see somebody get the shakes, in particular, like after they've had an awful lot of alcohol, a little too much from going to a party and then waking up the next morning. But it could even get to a point where it's so severe in terms of withdrawal symptoms that they hallucinate and have seizures, because the body just doesn't know how to function without having that substance in your body all the time. Okay, so that is alcohol. Let's talk narcotics now. Narcotics are opiates. They come from the poppy plant. Okay. So yes, we talked about this in Unit 1 when you guys did some experimental research when we were learning about the different types of variables and how we structure experiments. Poppy seeds have, they're tiny, tiny, tiny concentrations of opiates. Okay, because they come from the poppy plant, which is where opium is derived. So it's found in any number of substances. You can find narcotics are prevalent in morphine, which is used for surgery. Um, there are other variations of it that are used medicinally to help with pain management and things along those lines. You hear of it in Oxycontin, Vicodin, Percocet. It's also used in cough medicines. Down here, codeine. Codeine is prescription strength cough medicine. And then you have one that is particularly well known given the just massive epidemic that has occurred in this region in particular over the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years, which is heroin. Okay. Lots of kids have asked me in the past about methadone, because they've heard of methadone clinics and stuff like that, especially once the heroin epidemic started hitting pretty hard. Methadone's usually used to help people get off of their heroin addiction. It's prescribed in very carefully monitored scenarios. So it's to help wean them away from heroin usage. Um, but you're not seeing as much usage of that since Narcan came about, and has been used when people end up overdosing in heroin OD cases. So how opiates work is that they mimic endorphins in your brain. We've talked about what endorphins are. Do you remember Kevin Ware, the guy that felt no pain when he hurt himself so severely on the basketball court? Endorphins help you to not feel pain. And they can also provide a sense of euphoria. So it makes sense then that if somebody is to get their hands on a narcotic, they're going to feel this rush of euphoria, this sense of contentment, and pleasantness, and they won't feel pain. And so that's why you started to see so many become addicted to heroin kind of in a second-handed way, because they would start, excuse me, um, with pain pills like Vicodin to help them with true, legitimate medical pain reasons. And then they would just end up building up a tolerance and needing more and more and more and more. And then that ultimately led them down the rabbit hole of worse addictive issues. When heroin is injected, it's going to reach the brain in seconds, and the rush is incredibly intense, which is ultimately why it is so hard for those that are heroin addicts to overcome that addiction. Let me be clear that it not only is physically and psychologically addictive, it physiologically alters how the brain works. This is truly one of those drugs where one-time usage could completely disrupt normal brain functioning, um, because of how those chemicals interrupt neurotransmitter functioning. So this very well could be the circumstance of, what you used to learn about in DARE programs and stuff, of just doing a drug one time and never being the same ever again. And that lends credence an awful lot to why it is that you see circumstances of people that are addicted to heroin going through 6, 7, 8, 9 rounds of rehab, because their brain has and their neurochemistry has just been so significantly altered by what has come into their system. When we're looking at issues of withdrawal from heroin, it's awful. It is excruciatingly painful for those who go through it. Not only do you have the craving for heroin again, but there are fevers, there's chills, there's muscle cramps. They can develop stomach problems where, with serious issues with nausea, they can become dehydrated because they're throwing up a lot. It's an awful experience to go through, which is another reason I think why one could understand why it's so challenging for those who become addicted to heroin to go through the experience of, um, weaning away from that drug when you know that this is what you're staring down the barrel of to try to get over the addiction. And so these symptoms of addictive properties, with withdrawal symptoms, are prevalent for any kind of opiate. So if you're trying to come away from a Vicodin, a pill addiction, the same thing would apply there. Obviously, it would be far more intense if it were heroin or, what you're seeing an awful lot of now on the street, which is fentanyl. It's far more intense. So let's switch gears now and move on to a different category. We're going to talk about stimulants. So if depressants are all about suppressing or slowing down your central nervous system functioning, welcome to the stuff that speeds that sucker up. So stimulants are going to increase your brain activity. They're going to arouse behavior, and they will give you increased mental alertness and increased energy. The most common examples out there that we're going to talk about for today, there are plenty more. For example, nicotine. You see this an awful lot with vaping. And you're seeing, marijuana being used in vape products as well. So that's kind of pulling its way into it and making it a combo stimulant hallucinogen. But nicotine is technically a stimulant. And so the ones that we're going to talk about are caffeine, cocaine, and amphetamines, which are more commonly known now as crystal meth. Amphetamines used to be diet pills that were prescribed a while back, and then they've morphed into the far more potent and nasty crystal meth. So we'll tackle each one of these guys individually. So, some stuff to know about with regard to caffeine. It's the most widely used psychoactive drug out there. Okay. Not just legally, but illegally too. It is the most widely used psychoactive drug. Lots of kids, when I say that, they're just like, I thought it was weed. Marijuana is the most widely used illegal drug. And now that even has an asterisk next to it, simply just because more and more states are legalizing recreational usage to an extent, and many more are legalizing it more openly for medical purposes. But caffeine is found in a lot of stuff that a lot of kids don't realize. Chocolate has caffeine. There are over-the-counter medications that have it. So, for example, Excedrin, migraine meds, they have caffeine in there because there's some evidence that shows that a small amount of caffeine can actually help alleviate migraine pain. Obviously, it's in tea and coffee. You've seen me drink my coffee all over the place. Many of you guys, you've seen me in the afternoons drinking it too. My seventh belt peeps, shout out to you. You've seen me chugging it sometimes because I feel like I hit my 2 o'clock wall and I just start getting real sleepy again. The way that caffeine works, and you've heard me talk about this when I've discussed my own habits when it comes to ingesting caffeine, it is going to go to your cerebral cortex. If you remember, that guy is that higher level decision making and processing part of your brain. It's all the wrinkly part. And so what happens is the person becomes just way more alert and awake. And truly, once I get myself a good amount of caffeine in the morning when I wake up and I'm just hardcore dragon, if I drink my coffee fast enough, quickly enough, and I make it strong enough, I feel pretty wide awake very, very, very quickly. But the thing that's important to recognize is there is no such thing as a safe drug. You heard me talk about that in the last video. And the more and more and more and more of caffeine that I need, the higher the likelihood that I could put myself into some serious trouble. It is possible for a person to die from too much caffeine. There have been rare circumstances where that is the case. However, a person ingested far more than their body could handle. And so their heart rate increased because caffeine's a stimulant. And so the central nervous system sped up and their hearts gave out on them. Okay. So at high doses, caffeine can produce anxiety. It can create issues with insomnia, heightened restlessness. So, I mean, obviously, there are some people who are acutely sensitive to caffeine. I am. So, I mean, if I had a cup of coffee before I went to bed, I'd have a hard time sleeping. My husband, on the other hand, he could drink a cup of coffee right before he goes to bed, and it doesn't seem to impact him in any way, shape, or form. But if you do it too intensely, you can end up developing something that they call coffee nerves. Caffeine is physically addictive. I will readily acknowledge I have a physical addiction to my coffee. When I go without it and I go straight up cold turkey, the result is awful. It's really, really unpleasant. I went off of caffeine once. Um, I didn't wean myself away from it and just, make my amount smaller and smaller and smaller over a gradual period of time. I just cut it off immediately and instantaneously for a medical issue. And I had a week-long migraine. It was not fun. It was just a constant recurrent headache. Obviously, I was far more irritable because I didn't feel well. I was struggling hardcore, just always sleepy. And so it was most certainly not a pleasant thing. It's also very shocking to students when they hear that I did not drink caffeine or coffee when I was in my first trimester with either of my children. Um, my peers did not know that. I would still drink decaf, and because if I had just stopped drinking caffeine, everybody would have known I was pregnant, and then the cat would have been out of the bag. But I did not drink caffeine because what they believe that there is a certain amount of caffeine that is safe for a fetus when it's developing, but they don't know that for sure. And so they recommend that you try to avoid anything that is completely not necessary to ingest in your first trimester. So that was what I did. And I don't think it was simply just pregnancy hormones that involved my heightened levels of irritability and being so tired. I was pretty unhappy and pretty miserable because I missed my caffeine and I was dragging an awful lot. So your recommended daily amount of caffeine that's acceptable and considered healthy for adults is 200 milligrams. So you're looking at right around like, a short coffee from Starbucks. I want you to take a look at the appropriate amount of caffeine for somebody who is in your age range. I'm going to give you a second to look at that. If you looked at the 100 milligrams piece, um, I think that's pretty surprising to an awful lot of kids. That is not even a full regular cup of coffee, not even half of it. Okay. And that's really shocking to a lot of teenagers. But the reality is, your body, we've said this numerous times through all of this with the drug content, you are still growing. And so when you expose yourselves to these drugs, even if they're legal, it can have altering consequences for somebody. And the interesting thing is, I'm going to bring this back to, I'll go back real fast to this piece. In terms of, at high doses, caffeine can produce anxiety. I often share this with my students that if you have an anxiety disorder, it's actually really, really, really not smart for you to drink caffeine, because it will heighten and amplify the anxiety that you already have in your regular everyday life. And a lot of that is because you're drinking way more than your body is supposed to be able to handle as a teenager. Okay. And let's be real. Most of y'all aren't sticking to just your short 8-ounce coffee from Starbucks. You're going with, the massive sized coffee that you can grab at UDF on your way into school. Because I see some of y'all walking around in the halls with it normally. So this is just something for you to keep in mind, that it's not necessarily safe for you to be ingesting the amount of caffeine that you're ingesting. It's probably not safe for me to be ingesting the amount of caffeine that I'm ingesting, because I'm a pretty petite person in terms of size. I, in most respects, probably have to take kid dosages for a lot of medicines. That's not a joke. That I really do have to do that sometimes. And so, it's just, but the thing to keep in mind that's different between me as opposed to you, I'm done growing. I stopped growing a while ago. I'm 20 years older than most of you guys, if not more than that. And so it's not going to have nearly the kind of impact on me in terms of my development as it would on you guys. So just something to consider. Amphetamines are now far more prominently known in the form of crystal meth, but amphetamines used to be called speed. They were diet pills that used to get prescribed. You would see it a lot in the 90s, in sports in particular with athletes. So you would see them doing amphetamines and steroids to try to get faster, get stronger, because what ended up happening was it would suppress their appetite and give them tons of energy. And so they would be able to just keep working out constantly. Problem was, it is highly addictive because they found that they needed more and more and more to maintain the same effect over time. And so people were developing crazy high tolerances, needing more, and they were becoming really, really, really addicted to it. Amphetamines have morphed in the 2000s into crystal meth. I know that I've got a lot of students out there who have watched Breaking Bad, thanks to the various different um, Netflix, Hulu, all that kind of stuff where you can binge watch stuff. Crystal meth is far more potent, far more concentrated, um, and it's pretty awful. This is another one of those kinds of drugs where it's like if you try it once, it is going to be very, 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 very hard to come back from it. You can inject it or you can smoke it. Most of the time you see crystal meth presented, it's gonna be smoked. But the way that it is produced is pretty interesting. It's done in street labs, or out in highly rural areas, because when crystal meth is cooked, it creates just an insanely potent smell that it's pretty rank. It's disgusting. It's very noticeable, and so they're not going to do it necessarily in homes where neighbors are right next to you because they'd be able to smell it and then they would call the cops on you. So you're going to go out into fairly rural areas where you don't have neighbors, or if you are in urban settings, so you're in cities and suburbs, you're going to do what they would call a mobile meth lab, where you're cooking all of this stuff in your trunk. An active ingredient in crystal meth is something called pseudoephedrine. Pseudoephedrine is found in an awful lot of over-the-counter allergy medicines that many of you guys are familiar with, which is why about a decade ago, all of your allergy meds pretty much had to go back behind the pharmacy wall or pharmacy desk because people were attempting to just buy it up in massively large quantities so that way they could use it to cook crystal meth. The way that meth works is increasing energy and boosting your mood. And because you feel like you've got so much energy, then what it does is it suppresses your appetite. So when you see people who are addicted to crystal meth, like this woman right here, not only does it age you just exponentially, and it's across the board. So I've got this link here that you'll have the opportunity to go take a look at. It's called The Faces of Meth. This website has become legendary, looking at pictures of people, their driver's license pictures, and or their very first arrest for the drug, and then seeing them only months later, and they have aged just so much. So this woman, this is her mugshot for being arrested for use of crystal meth, and this is 4 years later. Guys, I don't think I'm exaggerating much when I say this. She looks like she's 80 something. And I would argue that she's probably late 20s, early 30s. I mean, I'd be saying maybe pushing it to say she's my age in mid 30s. But you lose so much weight because you just don't eat. Not only do you lose the weight, but it turns your skin yellow. So you become very jaundiced. It creates lots of aging through wrinkles. Your skin becomes very sallow and saggy. And then two other scenarios that are often very common when you hear of crystal meth is meth mouth. That their teeth become crazy brittle because, again, they smoke it. So they're taking all of these horrendously harsh chemicals directly into their mouth. So their teeth turn yellow and they break, and it becomes pretty gross. And then the other thing is meth bugs. If you go to the Faces of Meth website that you'll see linked on Google Classroom, there are quite a few of the individuals that are on there who have just massive gaping sores and scabs all over their face. Because one of the things that happens when you're on crystal meth is you perceive that, if you want to talk about the mind altering perceptions of this stuff, you perceive that there are bugs crawling under your skin. And so what people do is they just scratch and scratch and scratch and scratch till they create gaping sores all over themselves. Clearly, looking at how awful the impact of this drug is for people who do it long term, it's pretty obvious that they're physically and psychologically addicting. When the effect wears off, the crash is so intense that it makes them want to be able to ingest the drug again. Because when you're dealing with depression, um, constant feeling of fatigue and headaches, highly irritable. And for some, especially if it was, used as a diet drug initially, when you had a massively large increase to your appetite, that wasn't something that was considered to be desirable for the person while they were doing it. So let's talk about cocaine real fast. Cocaine is, yes, it is derived from the leaves of the coca tree. Yes, it also used to be in Coca-Cola back in the day, hence how it got its name. But in the early 1900s, they started to realize, like, oh, cocaine, kind of addicting, not so good for you. Let's pull that out and replace it with another stimulant instead. And so that is how you got caffeine put into Coca-Cola rather than cocaine. The way the cocaine works is that when it's inhaled via snorting in a purified powder form, it's going to hit the brain in a few minutes. You are going to have a massively intense rush of euphoria, but it's only going to last, at most, guys, 30 minutes. And that's shocking to a lot of kids. That's why those who become addicted to cocaine become addicted. The crash hits after 30 minutes or so. And so you find yourself going and trying to snort more and more and more. Demi Lovato famously gave an interview after her first round in rehab where she flat out said when she was, a Disney starlet, she got addicted to cocaine and she could not go 30 minutes without getting more into her system to be able to function. Most kids are familiar with crack cocaine because it is far more concentrated and it became far more prevalent in the 80s. Crack in the 80s was truly what heroin has become for our present day circumstances. Crack cocaine was debilitating to those who became addicted to it because it worked way faster. The sense of euphoria that hits the rush is way more intense, but it's even more short-lived than the purified powder form of cocaine. So that led to far more intense crashes and more intense cravings for it, leading to far more powerfully addicting properties. It is physically and psychologically addictive, just like any of these other drugs have been thus far. Not only are you going to have agitation, depression, anxiety, and cravings for more, what it's going to do is it's going to create lasting depressive circumstances because cocaine completely depletes the brain of massive amounts of their neurotransmitters that you need for positive mood functionality. Remember, dopamine's your reward center neurotransmitter, so it helps you feel happiness, positivity, joy, excitement. Serotonin is linked to mood, and too little of it is connected to depression. Norepinephrine is a calming type of neurotransmitter, and so all of those are gone when a person ingests cocaine. So it takes a very long time for the brain to regenerate that amount. And so part of rehab for those who become addicted to cocaine can oftentimes involve treatment with antidepressants in order to be able to help them boost those levels in their brain. All right, so I've been talking for a while now. Let's try to wrap this up quickly for you guys so that way you don't have to keep hearing me talk. Last category we're going to tackle is hallucinogens. So they create extrasensory perceptual distortion. Okay, they're going to alter a person's mood. They very heavily impact judgment. And so the two types that we're going to spend the most time with is hallucinogenics with regard to LSD and marijuana. I get kids asking me about mushrooms, peyote, ecstasy. I get a lot of questions about drugs, if you couldn't tell. Ecstasy is technically a combo drug. It's stimulant and hallucinogen. So that's why it doesn't technically fall directly under this category. And just to be perfectly honest, we don't really need to spend time talking about mushrooms and peyote. So these are the two most significant ones that are most widely used hallucinogenics. So LSD stands for lysergic acid diethylamide. Yes, it was originally created by somebody who is trying to make a drug to treat schizophrenics. And the irony is not lost that LSD makes you hallucinate, and schizophrenics, one of the most common symptoms you see in individuals who have schizophrenia, it is hallucinations. But a millionth of an ounce produces profound impact on a person psychologically, which I think is fascinating, just how tiny the amount needs to be in order for a person to get this into their system and have mind-altering effect. LSD mimics serotonin. And so that's why it makes the person have like a really positive, happy mood. And that's why it was like the drug of choice of the hippies. When a person trips out on LSD, they experience any number of perceptions. They're typically pretty intense and very rapidly changing. And so it is very common for a person to hallucinate. A bad trip can have life-altering consequences. It can lead to a psychotic break, produce extreme amounts of anxiety, cause panic attacks. So it's not as if LSD can't have life-altering impact. It's important to recognize heavy users of LSD don't develop physical dependence for it, nor are they going to have withdrawal symptoms if it's not taken. So it's not addicting in that regard. But there are highly adverse reactions to LSD. A person can, in some ways, develop symptomology of post-traumatic stress disorder. They'll have flashbacks. They can have nightmares back to the bad trip. They can experience depression because, back up here, It impacts serotonin levels, and it can make somebody psychologically unstable. There is a fairly well-known stereotype out there about hippies who partook of way too much LSD. And so they, in combination of that and marijuana, ended up becoming what is pretty prevalently known as being baked. And they have permanent impact on their brain as a result of that. So let's talk about marijuana. Marijuana is derived from the hemp plant. Okay, and so it's one of the most widely used illegal drugs. We already talked about the asterisk that goes along with that. The active ingredient is THC, which is what creates the hallucinogenic property. Now, I get a lot of questions from kids about medical marijuana and what makes it different. I'm not going to be able to tell you ultimately that I am like some amazing chemist who understands all of this. However, my knowledge of medicinal marijuana is that the THC amount in there is significantly diminished through the growing process to ensure that the hallucinogenic property of the marijuana is not nearly as prevalent in medical marijuana as it would be in recreational usage. How it works is that the THC shuts off neurotransmitters that are meant to inhibit uh, certain drugs from continuing. And so when it shuts off those inhibitory neurotransmitters, what it basically does is it lets dopamine just totally flood the brain. And remember, dopamine is your feel good, happy, reward sensing neurotransmitter. You get the same kind of dopamine rush from, eating an Oreo as you could from essentially from smoking a joint. Okay, and that's because dopamine is flooding the system in both of those scenarios. Okay, marijuana is not physically addictive. However, it is psychologically addicting. There are many people who try to self-medicate with regard to their mental health issues via depression and anxiety. And they tell themselves, I need to smoke in order to stop feeling so panicky or anxious. But there's no evidence out there in terms of medicinal marijuana for that being used widely as a means to treat anxiety disorders or to treat depression. Chronic users, it's also important to note, if they ingest high doses of it, can experience withdrawal symptoms. If they stop, they can be highly irritable. They can, their appetite can drop. They can have tremors, issues with sleeping, and be highly restless as a result as well. So it's, even recreational usage can be problematic, especially to teens. There is a substantial amount of research that is piling up more and more and more and more that teens who ingest marijuana recreationally, and even more so than that, who do it daily, are putting themselves into positions where they're causing lifelong damage to their brain. Their learning and cognitive functioning is impaired. Their IQ drops. And so this was stuff that was presented to you in those articles before you watched this video. So the way that marijuana works is when it leads to those sensory distortions, it creates a hallucinogenic experience. And the reason why people often end up using it or enjoy it as much as they do is because it creates mild euphoria and this sense of very relaxed, blissed out, laid back kind of feeling. And so people don't feel as overwhelmed by, the stuff that they've got going on in their life, for example. Medical use of marijuana, we've discussed this, it's limited and controversial. It's becoming more widely okayed by state legislatures. And part of that is because of its medical benefits. It's been shown to help people with pain, chronic issues of pain. It works with slowing down seizures in epileptic patients. It can help with hypertension and nausea from chemotherapy in particular. It helps with pain from glaucoma, which is an eye condition, and it can help treat and lessen asthmatic attacks, essentially. Problem is, marijuana interferes with muscle coordination. and perceptory processes. So there's been a substantial amount of compilation of research that shows the impact that it has on a person's driving ability. You should not smoke and get behind the wheel of a car. It is just not a good idea. And there have been many, 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 many accidents that have occurred. There was a massive uptick when Colorado, for example, who was one of the first states to legalize marijuana for recreational use, there's a staggering rise in their accidents. And it was because so many people were smoking up recreationally, getting behind the wheel of a car, and then they didn't have the reaction time they needed to be able to stop an accident from happening. It's been shown to interfere with memory. It impacts your limbic system. We've talked about that. And reproductive processes. There's been some linkage to male sterility issues. There has been some discussion, my generation in particular, there have been lots of difficulties with people of my generation in being able to have children for whatever reason, but much of it has been linked to the fact that my generation has been the one that's been so big on pushing recreational marijuana usage. And there have been some corollary studies that have shown significance of marijuana usage to preventing couples from being able to have children because of sterility due to marijuana usage. So, with that, I've talked your ears off. Kudos to you if you have stuck it all the way through this video because this is a beast. Obviously, if you've got any questions, feel free to let me know. I appreciate your attention. I know this was a long one to sit through, and for some of you guys, probably not so exciting. But nevertheless, it is important for you to know within this content because it deals with lots and lots on psychological processes. So have a good one, guys. Let me know if you need anything.